going to share some thoughts on birth of force within deep water. So far in deep water, what I've shared is the notion of a deep water that appears in time and a deep water that appears in space. Following this, I arrived at a conclusion that our causal models for organization and system need to be enhanced, and so we looked at emergent properties in a causal wedge that determines the space within which organizations and systems play. So we looked at the emergent properties. Last week, we took a deeper look at the nature of space and time, which were both fractal. And today I want to spend a few minutes to talk about or to share some thoughts on the birth of force within this causal wedge. So when we think about time, what we saw is that there's a pattern that appears in time regardless of scale, and this pattern can be summarized or represented by this growth of a seed into a flower that actually is the movement through the physical, vital, and mental space. Now, so long as an organization, an individual, an organization, a market, any kind of instance of an organization is playing within this space here, so this space, let's just call it the physical vital space, it's going to be animated by a number of tightly bonded structures. And a few weeks ago I had talked about a spin theory of emotions in which I drew attention to these tightly bonded structures, which are a manifestation in space of the same pattern that occurs in time. So each of these tightly bonded structures has a physical, vital, and mental component to it, where the vital is really a feeling that draws our attention to this tightly bonded structure that exists within us and that really determines our perception and our orientation to ourselves and to things around us. Now the fact is that so there are many of these that exist in any organization that is playing in this space here, and so long as these exist and so long as we invest in them, there is a spin that occurs so that they create a field around them and attract like elements and repel unlike elements, so that there is some kind of a polarity, and the notion of like and dislike and preferences and things not preferred become clear. And so long as this happens, we are continually investing in a perception and a way of being that's going to continue to attract the reality that we've already been playing with all this time. Now, it is only when we begin to enter into some kind of stillness within these bonded structures, so we stop the spin and therefore stop the field that is created because of the spin, that we have the opportunity to really deconstruct these bonded structures. And when we have the opportunity to deconstruct these bonded structures, then something from the underlying fullness behind each point in space has the opportunity to emerge. Now, the time that we spend in this phase is shorter or longer depending on whether we do the work individually, in a team, in an organization, in a market, in a larger system, to deconstruct these bonded structures. Now, this is looking at it through time, but if we think about space, and let's just remind ourselves what we said about the constitution of space. There's 4 elements that comprise fullness of any point of space. So there's a fullness behind any point in space, and this fullness has the properties of omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, omnicaring, where omniscience, for example, can be thought of as a set of many different characteristics like knowledge, wisdom, laying down of large laws, and so on. Omnipotence can be thought of as a set that comprises of characteristics such as power, courage, leadership, justice, and so on. Omnipresence can be thought of as a set that comprises of characteristics such as service, perfection, detailed orientation, a self-giving, humility, and so on. And omnicaring can be thought of as a set comprising of characteristics such as love, mutuality, harmony, relationship, and so on. So what we were saying is that every point in this causal wedge has fullness behind it, and in space there's a differentiation so that there's an infinite variation in space, and this infinite variation is really a function of the combinations of all these different possibilities. So coming back here, we have this fullness that underlies any emergence in time, and then through the play of time, if we deconstruct these bonded structures, then the aspect of fullness that was behind this will begin to manifest in that flower that we see. And again, this is a function of this fourfold order within space, within deep space, if you will. So when we talk about a birth of a force, the emergence of this is really referring to the birth of force. So what actually is force? So if we contrast it to this kind of dynamic that's occurring here, we've already said that spinning bonded structures that are tightly bonded really create small fields around them, and so there's various kinds of attractions and repulsions. So there's polarity that's created, and then there's a whole play of attractions and repulsions, and so there's a certain kind of orientation and a certain dynamic that's created outside of oneself or in a team or in an organization that creates the possibilities of what can happen. When we talk about force, we're not talking about these likes and dislikes, but we're talking about something that is innately present in every instance of space that's behind everything, that can now emerge in more of the fullness of what it is in its reality, and that has a totally different effect on our playing field. So if we represent that through our causal wedge of time and space, and recall that earlier on we had referred to this boundary as a time-space boundary X, then the normal play, for instance, without the occurrence of, or the birth of a force, if we think about an instance in space, or an instant of space, then there's a whole emergence of the possibility that may take a long time for it to happen. Now, with the birth of a force, we see something very different happen, because we have now something that is primal, that is innate to the notion of fullness, And let's just represent that by, say, this symbol of fullness, where we have one aspect or one edge that is clear, and then what happens is that any kind of differentiation in space, so any other play of possibility where this component exists, by contagion is also affected. So if there is strong justice, for example, that appears in space, and that justice is not about likes and dislikes, attractions and repulsions, but it's something primal, something innate that's coming forward from the reality that animates or is existent underneath everything, then that justice can rip through, or by contagion spread through a much larger space in a much shorter time. As a result of this, the development that happens at boundary X, if a force is birthed or surfaced, can be brought forward to this time-space boundary, so that in effect the X is happening here, and by the time we came to the old X, there's a whole new development that is now occurring. So there's an acceleration of development as a result of the birth of force. Now, a couple of examples that we can take from the last decade or so, or the last 15 years, if we think about, for example, three companies, Apple, Facebook, and Google. If we think about the real competitive advantage or the force that Apple represents at its core, and we represent it in the same notion of fullness, so we have omniscience, we have omnipotence, we have omnipresence, and we have omnicaring. I would argue that Apple's competitive advantage is that of creating gadgets and devices with superior user interface. And if we think about user interface, then there is some aspect there of a high degree of service. So I'll call that, I'll represent that by the arrow that is closest to the omnipresence. And then there is also a degree of mutuality or harmony in the way that that device manifests. So I'll represent that by this arrow of omnicaring. If we think about Facebook, for instance, and put it in the same format here of fullness, so we have omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, and omnicaring, then Facebook really is about being able to develop community quickly. And if we think about community, that is an element of the set that belongs to omnicaring. There are other factors, but that's the prime thing. And then if we think about Google, for instance, under the same framework, where we have omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, and omnicaring, then Google is about the superior organization of information, and I would say that that has to do with a notion of a high degree of knowledge. So I'll represent omniscience, and then also of superior organization, and I'll represent that by the element that is closest to omnipresence. So there's a very characteristic fractal imprint, if you will, that's distinct for these three perhaps examples of Apple, Facebook, and Google represent the emergence of force. And the consequence of this is that any other element in space, a differentiated element, for example, that has this pattern as part of its makeup, or this pattern as part of its makeup, or this pattern here as part of its makeup, is similarly affected very, very quickly, and there's a rapid thrust of development that occurs within a quicker time and space. So those are some thoughts on birth of force.